Hey guys, tonight we're going to step back in time, thousands of years, into the heat and dust of ancient Egypt, where a boy was born who would go on to become one of the most legendary rulers in history. Picture the sun blazing down on the Nile, a young prince cradled in the lap of luxury, surrounded by the sounds of bustling cities and the soft whispers of destiny calling. This was the world into which Ramses II, or Ramses the Great, was born. But it wasn't all golden chariots and grand palaces right from the start. In fact, you probably wouldn't have survived to witness his rise to power. Given the brutality and peril of those ancient times, just ask any Egyptian toddler trying to avoid a crocodile while playing near the river. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching from somewhere far away, drop your location and the time there in the comments. I always love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Ramses II wasn't always the great eye. He was born in 1303 BC as Ramses Miriamun, the son of Pharaoh Seti I and Queen Tuya. His childhood was marked by privilege. He was a direct heir to the throne of Egypt. And as you might imagine, that meant he was groomed for greatness from a very early age. His father, Seti, was no slouch himself. He was a skilled warrior and an ambitious king who expanded Egypt's borders and built monuments in the name of his reign. But Seti wasn't just passing down wealth and power to his son. He was also handing down something more: intangible expectations. For a boy like Ramses, those expectations loomed large, and there was no time to be a kid. Historians still argue about how much of Ramses's childhood was spent in actual war training. But what we do know is that he was steeped in military culture from an early age. Ramses wasn't just playing with toys in a palace. He was taught to wield weapons, to lead soldiers, and to think like a king. By the time he was in his early teens, he had already seen battle. If you were standing in his shoes back then, it might have felt like you were thrust straight into the storm, destined to lead people probably much sooner than you'd like. But that was Egypt. The pharaoh wasn't just a ruler, he was a living god. His son would eventually be seen as a god in the making too. Ramses's early years weren't just spent getting tough in the military, though he was also learning the intricacies of administration, courtly life, and, of course, how to show his divine right to rule. He knew that in order to be a successful pharaoh, he couldn't just be a warrior. He had to be a master of diplomacy, religion, and image. He was watching, waiting, and absorbing everything around him as he learned that one day he would be the one making decisions that could mean life or death for thousands of people. Now, don't get too cozy, because this is where things start to heat up. Imagine being in your 20s, and suddenly you're thrust into the job of a lifetime without warning. This wasn't some smooth passing of the crown thing we might see in modern times, with speeches and ceremonies. When Seti I died in 1279 BC, it was Ramses who had to step up to the throne, even though he was just around 25 years old. You know that feeling when you're not quite ready for something, but you have to do it anyway. Multiply that by 1,000,000 and add the fate of an empire to the mix. Historians still argue whether Ramses was fully prepared to assume the throne. But one thing's for sure, he was ready enough to dive right into it, and dive he did. Right into the complexities of ruling a vast, ancient empire. But here's where things get interesting. What kind of pharaoh would Ramses II be? Would he be like his father, a builder and a military leader? Or would he forge his own path? It wouldn't take long for him to make his mark in both areas. He wasn't just handed the throne, he had to prove he could lead Egypt through the storms ahead. The real test would come soon enough in a battle that would define his entire reign. Let's step right into Ramses' military training. Because this guy wasn't just a pampered heir. Oh no, he was being prepped for one of the most physically demanding jobs in the ancient world. We're talking real battle, real stakes, Imagine growing up with a sword in one hand and a scroll of battle strategies in the other. That was Ramses II's childhood. From the moment he could walk, he was being conditioned to fight, command, and conquer. You probably wouldn't be able to last long if you were asked to spend your mornings running through sand dunes with full armor on. Would you? Yeah, me neither. But Ramses didn't have the luxury of complaining. Historians still argue whether Ramses' youth was truly spent fighting in the front lines or just preparing for the inevitable conflicts of adulthood. Some sources suggest that he was already participating in military campaigns by his early teens talk about a high-pressure upbringing. You've got to respect the guy. It's one thing to grow up with expectations to rule, and another thing entirely to train for battle with the threat of enemy forces looming over you. But the truth is, Ramses wasn't just learning to swing a sword. He was learning to think like a general. The early part of Ramses' reign was defined by one major event that set the stage for the rest of his rule, the Battle of Kadesh, which would come to define not just his military prowess, but also his legacy. Now, Kadesh wasn't just any battle. It was one of the largest chariot battles in history, and Ramses was right in the thick of it. It's said that Ramses personally led his troops into the battle. Confident of a quick victory, imagine yourself a young ruler leading your army into a decisive conflict with a fierce opponent. Sounds like a situation that could go from bad to worse in a heartbeat. Right. Well, that's exactly what happened. Here's where things get a bit murky. What you probably learned in history class about Kadesh might not be the full story. We've all heard that Ramses led a glorious, heroic charge and won the day. But historians still argue about the real outcome. The battle, which took place in 1274 BC, ended in what we'd call a stalemate. Sure, Ramses claimed victory in his inscriptions, but the reality might have been a bit more complicated. The Hittites, led by King Muwatalli II, didn't exactly roll over, and Ramses himself was forced to retreat at one point. So, why would Ramses claim such a resounding victory? Well, there's politics for you. When you're trying to cement your place as a god king of Egypt, a little exaggeration never hurt anyone. After all, if you're a pharaoh, every win has to look like divine intervention. In any case, Ramses used the battle to make a name for himself. He wasn't just a tactician, he was a master of propaganda. His inscriptions painted a picture of a fearless leader who defied the odds and triumphed against overwhelming forces. But whether it was a real victory or a clever piece of public relations, Kadesh was a pivotal moment in Ramses' reign. It showed his ability to lead men into battle and how he could control the narrative of his own life. At this point, you're probably thinking, okay, sure, a battle. But what else did Ramses do to shape Egypt's future? Well, let's talk about his obsession with monuments. Because, my friend, Ramses didn't just want to be a great warrior, he wanted to be remembered for eternity. And what better way to ensure that than by literally carving your name into the landscape? Historians still debate how many monumental projects Ramses actually completed, but it's generally accepted that he constructed more grand structures than any other pharaoh. His building spree was legendary. Temples, statues, and obelisks. Nothing was too grand for Ramses to claim as his own. One of his most famous projects was the creation of the Abu Simbel temples. These colossal statues of Ramses, each towering 66 feet tall, are carved directly into the mountainside. Imagine seeing these giant figures staring down at you as you approach, a reminder of the pharaoh's eternal reign. If Ramses didn't strike you with a spear on the battlefield, he was going to strike you with his monuments, just in case you forgot who was in charge. But not all of Ramses' building projects were purely self-aggrandizing. Some were strategic, meant to assert Egyptian dominance over the surrounding regions. The Abu Simbel temples, for instance, were built far south, near the Nubian border, to remind the kingdom of Kush and other neighboring civilizations of Egypt's power. In this way, Ramses used architecture not just as a show of wealth, but as a tool of diplomacy and control. And let's not forget Ramses' love for grandiose funerary temples. He built not one but two massive temples to honor the gods and secure his place in the afterlife. Now, these weren't just any temples. These were grand, monumental structures that could have been mistaken for small cities. It's almost like Ramses was preparing for an eternity of being celebrated. His temples weren't meant to impress his contemporaries. They were for the future, for the generations to come, and to ensure that he was never forgotten. You've probably noticed by now that Ramses the Exo wasn't just about winning battles and erecting monuments. He was all about securing his legacy, one way or another. And one of the most interesting aspects of his rule was how he stepped into the shoes of Pharaoh at such a young age. When Seti I passed away, Ramses was only about 25 years old. But the throne didn't come with a manual, and the stakes were incredibly high. Imagine being handed control of an entire empire at such an early age, knowing that every decision could shape the fate of your people for centuries to come. You wouldn't want to mess it up. Right. Neither did Ramses. Historians still argue about how ready Ramses really was to rule. Some suggest that Seti I left him well prepared, training him both in military strategy and the finer arts of statecraft. Others think he might have been a little green at first, figuring things out as he went along. Either way, Ramses' first few years on the throne weren't just about commanding armies or overseeing monumental construction projects. They were about securing his position and making sure everyone, especially Egypt's powerful priesthood, knew that he was in charge. But while his military victories and monuments took center stage, Ramses also had to deal with something far more dangerous: internal politics. In ancient Egypt, it wasn't just about winning battles, it was also about winning over the right people. The priesthood, the nobles, and the military elite. These were the people who could either prop you up or drag you down. Ramses had to navigate a delicate balance, keeping these power players on his side while also asserting his authority. Sounds like a political tightrope, doesn't it? Well, for Ramses, it was a high-wire act that lasted the better part of his reign. Now, let's talk about the divine right to rule, because this was a cornerstone of Ramses' power. In ancient Egypt, being Pharaoh wasn't just about bloodlines. It was about being the living God on earth. The gods didn't just bless the Pharaoh, they chose him. And Ramses was no stranger to this divine status. He didn't just rule Egypt. He ruled on behalf of the gods themselves. If he was seen as a living deity, his actions would be interpreted as divine will, and his word would be law. So when he made decisions, whether it was going to war or building a temple, he wasn't just acting as a mortal king. He was channeling the will of Ra, Osiris, and all the other gods of the Egyptian pantheon. This divine aura was crucial in maintaining the loyalty of the people. Think about it. If you were an ordinary Egyptian, would you want to defy a man who could claim to be the living manifestation of a god? Ramses made sure that no one would question his divine status, whether it was through giant statues of himself as a god, inscriptions that declared his divine victory at Kadesh, or elaborate ceremonies that reaffirmed his connection to the gods. Ramses' rule was constantly reinforced by this divine narrative. He wasn't just a king, he was the intermediary between the gods and humanity. And in a society as deeply religious as ancient Egypt, that gave him an almost untouchable status. But it wasn't just about image and power. Ramses was also keen on cultivating alliances. If he wasn't commanding armies on the battlefield or overseeing temple construction, he was actively engaging in diplomacy with Egypt's neighbors. Ramses didn't shy away from the idea of marriage as a political tool, and he married multiple wives throughout his reign. Some of these marriages were to secure alliances with powerful foreign kingdoms, while others were more personal, and at the heart of these relationships was his great love for his queen, Nefertari. Historians still argue about the exact nature of Ramses and Nefertari's relationship, But one thing is clear. Nefertari was far more than just a political pawn. She was Ramses' chief wife, and the two seemed to share a deep affection, something rare in the often cold, politically driven world of royal marriages. Ramses even had a temple built for Nefertari at Abu Simbel, a gesture that was both an expression of love and a clear statement of her importance in his reign. In a way, Nefertari's role in Ramses' life and rule helped humanize him aside of the pharaoh that history sometimes overlooks. Ramses had many wives, but Nefertari was the queen. Not only did she share the throne with him, but she was also revered by the people, and her status as great royal wife was unmatched. Her temple at Abu Simbel is adorned with incredible depictions of Ramses and Nefertari, side by side, suggesting that she held equal stature in their relationship. For Ramses, this was not just about securing his legacy through monumental building projects. It was about forging a strong partnership that would support him throughout his rule. At the same time, Ramses' numerous children, including over 100 sons, were carefully positioned to play important roles in his administration. They were not just his heirs in a literal sense. They were future pharaohs, generals, and priests. By spreading his offspring across the key positions of power, Ramses ensured that his dynasty would continue long after his death. His efforts to establish a multi-generational dynasty were no accident. They were part of his long-term vision of a ruling family that would endure for centuries. All right, so we've covered Ramses' early years, military campaigns, and how he cultivated his divine image. But there's one huge moment in his life that we need to dive into. A moment so legendary that it has shaped the way history remembers him, and that's the Battle of Kadesh. If you're imagining a clash of titans with chariots flying through the dust, you're on the right track. But there's more to this than just battle cries and glory. The Battle of Kadesh wasn't just a turning point for Ramses in terms of military strategy. It was a masterclass in how to spin a story, how to turn a seemingly unsuccessful campaign into a triumph that would echo through the ages. To set the stage, let's rewind to 1274 BC. The Hittite Empire, a powerful force to the north of Egypt, had been expanding its reach, and Kadesh was the key city in the strategic conflict between Egypt and the Hittites. Ramses, who was feeling bold after his relatively successful military experiences so far, led his army estimated to be around 20. Zero strong in a battle, the city of Kadesh was crucial, and Ramses intended to take it. But what he didn't know was that the Hittites were ready for a fight. With a much larger force of around 40 zero soldiers waiting to trap him. So, imagine this. You're Ramses, leading your troops with the belief that victory is just around the corner. You've got a plan. You've got the faith of the gods on your side, and everything's lined up for a quick win. But then plot twist, things go sideways. The Hittites, led by King Muwatalli II, launch a surprise attack. In fact, Ramses finds himself in a precarious situation, surrounded and nearly overwhelmed. According to the historical accounts, Ramses and his troops were caught off guard, and for a while, it looked like his military career might come to a very early end. Historians still argue about how much of this was true, though some think that Ramses might have exaggerated the danger of the battle to make his eventual victory sound all the more spectacular. After all, in the world of ancient Egypt, there was no room for defeat, especially when you're the living god of your people. Ramses' inscriptions from the time depict him as having been nearly defeated, only to turn the tide with his sheer bravery and divine favor. But let's be real here. When the pharaoh's life is on the line, you don't want to just be the victor. You want to be the hero of the story. And that's exactly what Ramses did. Ramses' version of the Battle of Kadesh is full of grand moments where he single-handedly turns the tide, defeating the Hittites and emerging as Egypt's eternal champion. He even went as far as to create detailed inscriptions across Egypt's temples and monuments, all portraying him as the glorious victor. If you've ever seen images of the pharaoh carved into stone, standing tall and proud next to his chariot, it's a product of that self-promotion. In fact, some experts believe that Ramses didn't just spin a good story, he actively manipulated the entire battle's narrative to secure his status as one of Egypt's greatest rulers. But the truth behind the battle is more nuanced. While Ramses might have held on in the face of adversity, the outcome was actually a stalemate, with neither side claiming a definitive victory. This is where things get interesting, because while Ramses may not have completely defeated the Hittites, he still managed to secure peace. A few years later, the Treaty of Kadesh was signed, one of the earliest known peace treaties in recorded history. It was an agreement that brought an end to the conflict between Egypt and the Hittites, solidifying Ramses' reputation as a shrewd diplomat. So while the battle may not have been the crushing victory Ramses wanted to portray, the peace that followed ensured that his legacy as a ruler and peacemaker was intact. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate how incredibly smart Ramses was. He knew that wars weren't just fought on the battlefield. They were fought in the hearts and minds of the people. His ability to spin the Battle of Kadesh into a story of triumph was a stroke of genius, and it became one of the defining moments of his reign. Ramses didn't just want to be remembered as a military leader. He wanted to be remembered as the pharaoh who could never be defeated, whose victories were divinely ordained, and whose name would be etched into history forever. But Ramses didn't stop at the battlefront. The Battle of Kadesh was important, but it was the subsequent treaty, the diplomatic fallout, and his ability to make alliances that truly cemented his power. After all, wars are fought to secure peace, and Ramses managed to bring peace to Egypt after years of conflict. By marrying the daughter of the Hittite king, Ramses was able to secure a lasting peace, proof that he was a master of both war and diplomacy. Ramses II's legacy was solidified not only through his military victories, but through his careful crafting of his image as a ruler, whether it was through grand monuments, strategic marriages, or clever propaganda. Ramses ensured that his name would live on long after his death. And at the heart of it all was his ability to blend war, politics, and divine symbolism into a seamless narrative that made him a god in the eyes of his people. Now, it's time to shift gears and talk about something that, while not exactly as flashy as a grand military victory or a newly constructed monument, was just as crucial to Ramses II's long reign, his incredible longevity. Ramses' reign stretched a jaw-dropping 66 years, from 1279 BC to 1213 BC. And let me tell you, he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. To put that into perspective, imagine living long enough to not only see the rise and fall of multiple generations, but also to become the stuff of legend. In fact, Ramses was so long-lived that some ancient Egyptians considered him immortal. And it wasn't just the public image he built that made people believe that. He lived and ruled so long that he essentially became synonymous with Egypt itself. He was the pharaoh of pharaohs. But here's where things get interesting. Ramses wasn't exactly the picture of a young ruler for the majority of his reign. By the time he reached his late 50s, most of the men who had served under him in his youth were either dead or retired. Yet he remained active, leading military campaigns, handling diplomatic affairs, and overseeing major building projects. Now, you might be thinking, how did he do it? Did he have some kind of magical powers? Well, not exactly. But he did have something that most rulers in the ancient world didn't: a well-organized, experienced, and loyal bureaucracy. Ramses knew how to delegate, which meant that even as he grew older, he could keep the empire running smoothly without personally overseeing every little detail. Historians still argue about the true reasons for his impressive longevity. Was it his diet, his constant physical activity, or perhaps some form of ancient Egyptian wellness that kept him on his feet longer than most. Ramses was well known for keeping himself in top shape. He practiced archery, chariot riding, and even martial arts to maintain his strength. And he didn't slack off in old age. You can almost picture him, despite being in his 60s, still managing to swing a sword like he was 25. And interestingly enough, ancient texts hint that Ramses believed strongly in the life-giving power of his divine status. His priests probably kept him well fed and well cared for, ensuring that he had access to the best food, medicine, and treatments available in the ancient world. Perhaps it wasn't just genetics that kept him going. Maybe it was his status as a living god that had some influence on his long, prosperous reign. But while Ramses was incredibly healthy and seemingly invincible, the fact is that he did eventually face the inevitable death. When he passed away, around 1213 BC, he was around 90 years old. Considering the average life expectancy in ancient Egypt was somewhere between 35 and 45, Ramses had lived a remarkably long life for someone in his time. But this wasn't just any death. Ramses' death marked the end of an era in Egypt. The man who had been king for over 6 decades was gone. And with him, the image of Egypt as the great, unstoppable empire began to shift. However, Ramses was prepared for this moment in the only way a pharaoh could be, by planning for his afterlife with the same meticulous care he gave his earthly rule. His tomb, located in the Valley of the Kings, was elaborate and built to house his body for eternity. But don't think for a moment that it was just about a burial. Ramses was building his immortality long before death even arrived. His tomb was filled with treasures, offerings to the gods, and statues of him, so that in the afterlife, he would still have everything he needed to continue ruling in the divine realm. Even his famous mummy, discovered in the early 20th century, has a story of its own. At the time of his burial, his body was embalmed and preserved with the utmost care, in line with Egyptian customs for royalty. But centuries later, in the 19th dynasty, his mummy was moved for safety. As tombs were being looted, his body eventually found its way to a royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, where it would be uncovered in 1881. Now, let's talk about something a little unexpected: Ramses' personal relationships. As you can imagine, being married to the Pharaoh of Egypt came with a certain amount of prestige. But Ramses had a long list of wives, and each marriage served a different purpose. His first and perhaps most famous wife was Nefertari, but he also had numerous other queens, some of whom were political alliances with foreign powers. If you think that sounds like something out of a dramatic courtly romance, well, you're not wrong. These relationships weren't just about love, they were about securing power. Ramses had over 100 children, some of whom went on to hold important positions within the kingdom. Historians still debate which of Ramses' children were the most important. But the truth is, by having so many heirs, Ramses ensured that his legacy would continue beyond his own reign. It was a genius move after all. Egypt wasn't a small kingdom, and it required multiple hands to manage such a vast empire. His children were not only meant to inherit his throne, though not all of them did, but many were also tasked with overseeing parts of the empire or holding military commands. Even with all of his military, architectural, and diplomatic accomplishments, Ramses' greatest feat may have been his sheer ability to create a lasting dynasty. When you think of ancient Egypt, chances are you're thinking about the grandeur of the pyramids, the Nile, the gods, and of course Ramses II, his descendants, though they wouldn't always measure up to his level of power, would continue to rule Egypt for generations to come. And in a way, that might be the ultimate proof of his success. He made Egypt into a lasting, eternal kingdom in the minds of the people as long as they remembered Ramses. His legacy would never fade. By now, you're probably thinking, okay, Ramses was a military genius, an unmatched diplomat, and an all-around legend. But there's another side to him that doesn't get as much airtime: the sheer scale of his building projects. While Ramses might be best known for his military conquests and divine self-image, it's his construction legacy that truly set him apart as one of Egypt's most prolific builders. If the Battle of Kadesh and his political savvy were the foundation of his reign, then his monuments were the towering pillars that held it up for centuries to come. Ramses had a particular knack for creating structures that not only honored the gods, but also reinforced his own power and glory. Just about everywhere you look in Egypt, you'll find his mark, whether it's a grand temple, a colossal statue, or an entire city. And it wasn't just about building for the sake of architecture. Each project was meticulously designed to remind his people that he was both a god on earth and a ruler beyond compare. This wasn't some vanity project. This was about solidifying his immortality, about ensuring that future generations would look back and remember Ramses as the living deity he proclaimed himself to be. One of Ramses' most famous and awe-inspiring constructions is the temple at Abu Simbel. Now, I'm sure you've heard of it, those colossal statues of Ramses, sitting proudly at the entrance, each one taller than a double-decker bus. Standing 65 feet tall, the statues of Ramses are designed to reflect his divine power. But what's even more mind-blowing is the sheer scale of the engineering that went into the temple. The entire complex was carved directly into the sandstone cliffs, making it an incredible feat of architectural and artistic genius. And get this, the temple was so precisely aligned that on 2 days each year, Ramses' birthday and his coronation day, the sun would shine directly into the inner sanctum, illuminating the statues of Ramses and the gods he held dear. You could say that the sun itself was honoring him. Talk about leaving a lasting impression. Historians still argue whether Ramses' decision to build the temple was entirely personal or if it also had a political motive. Some believe that he wanted to impress and control the Nubian people to the south, as Abu Simbel was located just outside Egypt's southern borders. Others think it was simply an expression of his divine right to rule, an attempt to make sure his people would never forget who was in charge. Whatever the reason, the temple stands as one of the most iconic symbols of Ramses' reign and his desire to make his mark on the world. But Abu Simbel wasn't his only major project. Ramses also built extensively in the city of Pi Ramses, which he made his capital during much of his reign. This city was a colossal urban project that spanned vast areas, with palaces, temples, and public buildings, all designed to reflect the pharaoh's power. It was the center of Egypt's political and religious life during Ramses' rule, and it became a symbol of the strength and vitality of his reign. Pi Ramses was a city designed not just for the people who lived in it, but for the world to see. Ramses wanted to demonstrate that Egypt was a kingdom of unrivaled power, and nothing says unstoppable quite like an entire city built to your name. And, of course, Ramses had a hand in constructing many temples dedicated to the gods. Let's take, for example, the Temple of Karnak in Luxor. The size and scope of this place are beyond imagination, with countless statues, obelisks, and columns, all of them designed to glorify the gods and, by extension, Ramses himself. It wasn't just about religion. It was about tying his reign to the divine, creating a physical space where the gods could live and where his people could come to worship him. To Ramses, this wasn't just about appeasing the gods. It was about showing them and everyone else that he was worthy of their favor. But as much as Ramses was a builder, he was also a master of propaganda. His monuments and statues weren't just meant to awe the people, they were meant to remind them who was in charge. Take the famous Ramesseum, For example, a massive mortuary temple in Thebes dedicated to Ramses. This temple was full of inscriptions and imagery that depicted Ramses as a heroic, godlike figure, conquering enemies and commanding respect. The sheer number of statues and obelisks with Ramses' face carved into them was staggering. And let's not forget the famous battle scenes etched into the walls of many of his temples, showing him in the heat of battle, his enemies falling before his might. While we know that many of these depictions were exaggerated, remember the Battle of Kadesh. Ramses made sure his image was everywhere because the more people saw his face, the more they'd think of him as an invincible ruler. Historians still debate just how much of Ramses' building spree was driven by personal vanity versus genuine religious devotion. Some argue that his constant desire to immortalize himself reflects an insecure ruler, worried about being forgotten. Others believe that it was part of a larger, more genuine religious belief in his divine role as Pharaoh. Perhaps, as with many things in Ramses' reign, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. After all, why not combine religious devotion with political savvy? Why not ensure that future generations would remember you not only as a powerful ruler, but as a godlike figure who shaped the world? What can't be denied, however, is the lasting impact of his projects. Thousands of years later, people still marvel at the wonders he left behind. Abu Simbel, P. Ramses, the Ramesseum, the temples at Karnak. These are the structures that kept his name alive long after he passed from the mortal realm. While many pharaohs and kings are forgotten by history, Ramses II, thanks to his relentless construction and his ability to capture the public's imagination, will always be remembered as one of the greatest builders in human history. As we've seen, Ramses II's legacy is undeniably tied to his military victories and monumental construction projects. But there's another layer to his reign that is just as intriguing: his relationship with religion. Ancient Egypt was, of course, a deeply religious society. The gods were central to everything, from the daily lives of the common people to the grand politics of the pharaohs. And Ramses, in true form, wasn't just content with ruling as a mortal king. He presented himself as a living god. But it wasn't just about putting on a divine facade. Ramses was intimately involved in the religious practices of his time, working to strengthen Egypt's spiritual life, all the while reinforcing his own image as the divine, unchallenged ruler of Egypt. First, let's talk about how Ramses positioned himself as a god. As Pharaoh, Ramses was considered to be the intermediary between the gods and the people, a divine ruler whose authority was sanctioned by the gods themselves. He was associated with several deities, but the most important of these was Amun-Ra, the king of the gods. Ramses frequently used his royal titles to emphasize his connection with the gods. One of his most prominent titles was the living Horus, symbolizing his divine power on earth. This wasn't just a title, it was a daily reality for Egyptians. Ramses was the link between the divine realm and the earthly one, and it was his job to ensure that balance was maintained. Without him, Egypt would falter, and the gods themselves would grow angry. So, no pressure? That's right. But Ramses wasn't just about divine titles. He was also deeply involved in the religious rituals of his time. During his reign, Ramses participated in grand religious ceremonies, often with the same level of intensity as a high priest. And let's not forget the priests. Ramses knew how important they were to maintaining his power. Religious officials were often the ones who carried out daily rituals, but they also had a political influence that Ramses wasn't willing to take for granted. He used religion to control the narrative and remind the people that his rule wasn't just political, it was ordained by the gods. He often ensured that temples dedicated to the gods and to himself were lavishly constructed, with priests placed strategically to maintain his divine status. Ramses' devotion to Amun-Ra is perhaps best represented in his work at the Temple of Karnak in Thebes, where he made significant additions to the already colossal structure. He used the temple as a symbol of his divine right to rule. Inscriptions within the temple paint him as the direct representative of the god. And the sheer size of the structure itself is meant to awe and remind everyone of the pharaoh's divine status. Ramses made sure that his name was etched into the temple walls next to those of the gods, signifying that he, too, was part of the divine order. For the common Egyptian, seeing Ramses immortalized in these sacred spaces would only reinforce the idea that he was not just a ruler, but a god who had taken flesh. But it wasn't just Amun-Ra that Ramses sought to appease. During his reign, he also paid homage to many of Egypt's other gods, including Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and Ptah, the creator god. His devotion to these deities wasn't just about faith, it was also about securing Egypt's future. Every successful military campaign, every monument built, and every peace treaty signed had a divine explanation. And Ramses was quick to ensure that the gods were credited with his success. After all, if you're the living god of Egypt, you can't take full credit for everything. Can you? Ramses also had a personal connection with religion that went beyond his public image. For example, his relationship with his queen, Nefertari, was often framed within a religious context. Nefertari, widely regarded as his great love, was also deified during her lifetime. She was even referred to as Great One of the Harem and beloved of the god Ra. The two were often depicted together in religious monuments, with Nefertari standing beside Ramses as his equal in the divine order. This wasn't just a romantic gesture, it was a political one. 2. By elevating his wife to divine status, Ramses not only cemented her position in the royal court, but also made it clear to his subjects that their bond was one of divine harmony. Speaking of Nefertari, let's talk about her tomb for a second because it's one of the most breathtaking sights in all of Egypt. The tomb of Nefertari, located in the Valley of the Queens, is a masterpiece of Egyptian art. The walls are covered in vibrant paintings depicting the queen's journey to the afterlife, with scenes showing her being welcomed by the gods. Inscriptions on the walls of the tomb refer to Nefertari as the one who loves Ramses, the one whom he loves. These are not just romantic words, they are words of divine affection. Ramses wanted to make sure that Nefertari's legacy was immortalized as much as his own, and in many ways, he succeeded. Her tomb remains one of the most visited and studied in Egypt, a lasting testament to Ramses' devotion to her. But the most significant religious act of Ramses' reign might have been his role in securing Egypt's afterlife. The ancient Egyptians believed in a complex spiritual journey after death. And the Pharaoh, as a living god, had to ensure that he would be reborn into eternity. The construction of his tomb and his preparation for the afterlife were an expression of this belief. Ramses' tomb, though not as famous as those of the pyramids, was designed with great care and precision. It was a royal burial that reflected his status both on earth and in the divine realm. His body, carefully embalmed and preserved, was placed in a sarcophagus that would keep him safe for eternity. While his monuments in life were meant to immortalize him, his tomb was meant to ensure that his soul would continue to rule in the afterlife. Interestingly, the concept of divine kingship didn't end with Ramses. Later rulers, such as Ramses' successors, would continue to adopt many of the religious practices that Ramses had solidified during his reign. The idea of the pharaoh as a god, the close relationship with Amun-Ra, and the elaborate religious ceremonies all became central to the role of the Egyptian ruler for centuries to come. Ramses, in many ways, shaped not only his own time, but also the future of Egypt's religious and political structure. Historians still debate the depth of Ramses' personal faith versus his use of religion as a political tool. Did he truly believe in the gods? Or was he just playing the role that needed to be played to maintain his power? It's likely that both aspects were true. He was, after all, a ruler who had mastered the art of balancing personal devotion with the needs of the state. Religion was as much a tool of governance as it was a matter of the heart. By this point, it's clear that Ramses II wasn't just the ruler of a mighty empire, he was also an exceptional brand manager. His carefully crafted persona, both as a divine figure and a military genius, has endured for millennia, but as with any historical figure, his reign wasn't free from controversy or challenges. You can't rule an empire for over 6 decades without facing some bumps in the road. And while Ramses is often remembered for his triumphs, he also had to navigate tricky waters both at home and abroad. Let's take a closer look at some of the controversies, setbacks, and missteps that made his reign more complicated than the grand monuments would have you believe. One of the most significant challenges Ramses faced early on was the issue of succession. While he had over 100 children, only a handful of them had the skills or pedigree to succeed him as pharaoh. The problem was that his eldest son, Amuherkepeshef, a promising military leader, died while still young, and many of his other sons were either too young, too inexperienced, or simply not qualified to take on such a monumental responsibility. Ramses eventually passed the throne to his son Merneptah, but by then, Egypt was already starting to show signs of decline. So while Ramses' personal legacy remained strong, the legacy of his dynasty was more complicated. The very empire he worked tirelessly to build began to fragment soon after his death. And speaking of Merneptah, let's address the issue of Ramses' military campaigns. You know, as much as Ramses is hailed as a brilliant military tactician, he wasn't always on the winning side. Take, for example, the famous Battle of Kadesh, which we talked about earlier. Despite his monumental propaganda efforts, the battle was not the smashing success that Ramses claimed it was. Historians still argue over the actual outcome. But what we do know is that Ramses was caught in a precarious situation. His forces were ambushed by the Hittites, and although Ramses made a dramatic escape, it's clear that the battle didn't end with the complete Egyptian victory that he later claimed. In fact, there was no real victor in the battle. It was more of a stalemate. And yet, Ramses spun the story as if it was a victory, one that would resonate with future generations of Egyptians and cement his status as a heroic figure. His famous temples, like the one at Abu Simbel, are filled with depictions of him standing tall, sword raised, as he slays his enemies. But when we look closer, we can see that the reality of his military prowess was not as flawless as the monuments suggest. This clever propaganda worked for a while, of course. The public perception of Ramses was largely shaped by his ability to spin his failures into triumphs. But this version of events began to unravel over time, particularly as later rulers and historians gained access to records and more information about Ramses' military strategy. Then there's the issue of Ramses' foreign relations. While his reign was marked by military engagements, particularly with the Hittites, one of his most significant diplomatic successes was the Treaty of Kadesh, which he signed with the Hittite king, Hattusilithaz. This treaty, considered one of the world's earliest peace agreements, was groundbreaking. After decades of war, the two powers finally agreed to stop fighting, and in its place, they established an alliance. Now, this treaty is significant for several reasons. It was a victory in diplomacy, of course, but it was also another way for Ramses to shape his image as a ruler who wasn't just about fighting. He was a king who could forge lasting peace when it was needed. And let's not forget, the treaty was also a useful tool in promoting Ramses' status. The agreement was carved into a series of monuments, the most famous of which was placed in the Temple of Karnak. The treaty stated that both Egypt and the Hittites would not attack each other, and that they would come to each other's aid in times of crisis. To sweeten the deal, Ramses also married a daughter of the Hittite king, another move designed to solidify the peace through diplomacy and reinforce his image as a king who could conquer without the need for bloodshed. The terms of the treaty are still celebrated as a diplomatic achievement to this day. But here's the kicker. After Ramses' death, the treaty would not last forever. While the initial peace held for several decades, Egypt's influence began to wane in the following years, and the Hittites gradually reasserted their power. It's hard not to wonder whether the peace treaty was more of a temporary victory than a lasting one. After all, Ramses had been the one who brokered it. And once he was gone, Egypt's grip on the region weakened. But in his lifetime, the treaty was a remarkable diplomatic win, something that added to his aura as a statesman, not just a warlord. And here's another layer to all of this. Despite his apparent success on the battlefield and in diplomacy, Ramses was also wrestling with the political realities of governing an empire. As Egypt expanded, it became harder and harder for any single ruler to maintain control over all the far-flung regions. Ramses faced growing internal unrest during his reign. While his building projects were meant to unify the kingdom and glorify his name, they also placed a tremendous strain on Egypt's resources. The construction of his grand temples and cities, along with the constant military campaigns, drained the empire's treasury. And while Ramses's image remained that of a strong and all-powerful ruler, Egypt's economic difficulties started to show in the later years of his reign. Historians still argue whether Ramses ever acknowledged these internal issues. Some believe that, despite his best efforts to maintain Egypt's power and prestige, he couldn't stop the gradual decline of the empire. Others contend that Ramses was fully aware of the challenges he faced, but chose to focus on his personal legacy after all. He had built monuments to last millennia. His image as an eternal ruler would outlast any short-term political or economic problems. Still, even in the midst of apparent success, the cracks in Egypt's empire were beginning to show. Ramses' reign, then, was a delicate balancing act between military ambition, diplomatic strategy, internal politics, and the looming challenges of succession. Despite his nearly 70 years on the throne, the legacy of Egypt's greatness would be as fleeting as any other empire. While he ensured Egypt would be remembered as a world power, the empire itself couldn't keep up with the demands of such a monumental reign. Ramses may have been the last of Egypt's great pharaohs, but even he couldn't halt the slow decline that would follow in his wake. As much as we love to praise Ramses II for his grand military campaigns, monumental building projects, and the carefully constructed persona of a divine ruler, we can't ignore the fact that even he had his human side. Behind the towering statues and the regal titles was a man who had to deal with the day-to-day struggles of life, personal loss, political tension, and, of course, the complicated business of ruling over an empire. Let's take a look at some of the more personal aspects of Ramses' life, the things that show us the man behind the pharaoh, the father, the lover, and the ruler. For a ruler as powerful as Ramses, his personal relationships were as carefully curated as his public image. One of the most famous aspects of his personal life was his relationship with Nefertari, his great royal wife. Nefertari wasn't just the love of Ramses' life, she was his equal in every sense of the word. If you've ever seen the tomb of Nefertari, you know that it's one of the most beautiful and well-preserved tombs in all of Egypt. The walls are covered in vibrant depictions of Nefertari's journey to the afterlife, where she is greeted by the gods. And you can sense the deep affection Ramses had for her in the way she's portrayed. Nefertari was, in many ways, the perfect companion for Ramses. She was not just a political partner, but a woman he adored. And Ramses made sure that her legacy would be as immortal as his own. Her tomb, with its exquisite artwork and detailed inscriptions, served as a testament to their love. Unlike many other pharaohs, Ramses did not just relegate his queens to the background. Nefertari was depicted with him in many of his grand monuments, a symbol of their divine and equal partnership. She was, after all, the mother of some of his most important children, and Ramses was keen to ensure that her status reflected that. But Nefertari wasn't the only woman in Ramses' life. As we know, Ramses had more than 100 children over the course of his long reign. While Nefertari remained the most prominent of his queens, Ramses had numerous other wives and concubines, many of whom played important roles in the political landscape of his reign. Among them was Isetnofret, another powerful and influential queen, and a number of lesser wives and daughters who were strategically married off to ensure political alliances. Ramses' family was not just a personal affair, it was a political tool, used to secure Egypt's interests and maintain his grip on power. Each marriage or union was part of a much larger plan to solidify his rule and ensure the stability of the empire. Still, the sheer number of Ramses' children raises questions about his personal life. Historians debate whether Ramses was truly a loving father to all of his children, or whether they were simply part of his grand scheme to maintain power. Some suggest that his many sons were groomed for positions of power within Egypt, while others point to the fact that Ramses had a deep affection for his children, particularly the sons who were appointed to key military and administrative positions. Whether his paternal care was genuine or politically motivated or a combination of both is still a subject of scholarly debate. But Ramses' personal life wasn't just about his relationships with his queens and children. It was also marked by immense personal loss. As a man who lived through a reign that lasted longer than most people live, Ramses saw his fair share of grief. His beloved Nefertari died before him, and Ramses was reportedly devastated by her loss. To commemorate her, he built a grand temple at Abu Simbel, but he also made sure her tomb was one of the most elaborate and intricate in all of Egypt. Her death marked a turning point in his life, and after her passing, Ramses seemed to focus even more on his public image, perhaps as a way to immortalize not just his rule, but the love he had for his first queen. But loss didn't end with Nefertari. Over the course of his reign, Ramses saw the deaths of several of his children and other loved ones. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like for a man who was not only the ruler of Egypt, but also a father and a husband, to experience such profound loss. And while Ramses was certainly known for his strength and military prowess, these personal tragedies likely took a toll on him. Historians still argue whether Ramses' reaction to loss and personal tragedy influenced his rule. Did he become more reclusive, more focused on his monuments, or more obsessed with his own immortality? Some believe that these personal losses drove him to build more temples, to construct larger statues of himself, and to ensure that his name would live on long after he was gone. After all, if you can't prevent death from claiming your loved ones, you can at least make sure your name and deeds are remembered forever. But in the midst of all his triumphs and tragedies, Ramses also had moments of humor and humanity. One of the most telling aspects of his character is his portrayal in art and literature. Unlike many other pharaohs, who were depicted as stoic, godlike figures with no room for humor, Ramses sometimes comes across as a figure with personality. Whether he was shown sitting on a throne with a slightly playful grin, or engaging in a moment of relaxation with his family, Ramses was often depicted as a figure who wasn't just about war and monuments. He was a man who, despite the grandeur of his reign, understood the importance of human connection. Even in the most grandiose scenes of battle, Ramses was often shown as calm, composed, and in control. But there's something in those depictions that suggests a man who enjoyed the role of being a pharaoh, who relished the idea of ruling, but who also knew how to enjoy his life in the moment. And when you think about it, that's a pretty remarkable quality in a ruler who had so many responsibilities weighing on his shoulders. Historians still debate whether Ramses' humanity is something we should recognize in our view of him as a king. Some say that his portrayal as a man of both strength and vulnerability makes him more relatable, less of a distant god king, and more of a ruler who, despite all his power, dealt with the same emotions and struggles that everyone faces. Others argue that his careful image making and propaganda efforts make it impossible to fully understand the real Ramses, the man behind the monuments. But in any case, what we do know is that his legacy is far more than just the result of military conquests and religious devotion. It's a story of a man who knew how to command an empire while also, in his own way, navigating the deeply personal aspects of his existence. By now, it's becoming clear that Ramses II was far more than just a warrior king. While his military conquests, monumental construction projects, and divine status were key components of his reign, another vital aspect of his legacy was the way he managed Egypt's resources and infrastructure. Though the grand temples and towering statues are the things that often come to mind when we think of Ramses, it's important to remember that he was also deeply involved in the practical side of governing, things like agriculture, trade, and perhaps most importantly, the upkeep of Egypt's vast infrastructure. Ramses inherited a powerful empire, but maintaining and expanding that power required careful attention to Egypt's economy and resources. Like any successful ruler, he understood that a strong army and impressive monuments weren't enough to keep an empire running smoothly. Behind the scenes, Ramses worked tirelessly to maintain Egypt's economic stability, and part of this involved managing the empire's resources, especially its most important, the Nile River. The Nile was the lifeblood of Egypt. Without its annual floods, the soil would remain barren, and Egypt's agricultural output would dwindle. Ramses, who is often remembered for his military prowess, also had a keen understanding of the importance of agriculture. During his reign, he undertook a number of initiatives to improve irrigation and agricultural techniques, ensuring that Egypt's fertile lands remained productive. In fact, Ramses is credited with overseeing a series of irrigation projects that helped Egypt become even more prosperous than it already was. But Ramses didn't just focus on the agriculture of Egypt's heartland. He also recognized the importance of maintaining trade routes to ensure the empire's wealth. Egypt had extensive trade connections with regions as far-flung as Nubia, the Levant, and even parts of Europe. Ramses encouraged the development of these trade networks, ensuring that Egypt remained a dominant economic power. As a result, Egypt's wealth grew, and Ramses used this newfound prosperity to fund his military campaigns and, of course, his building projects. In the same vein, Ramses also understood the importance of infrastructure in maintaining Egypt's power. The road networks of ancient Egypt were some of the most advanced of the time. These roads facilitated the movement of troops, traders, and resources throughout the empire, allowing Ramses to maintain control over Egypt's vast territories. While the vast majority of people lived near the Nile, Egypt's empire stretched far beyond its banks, reaching into Nubia and the Levant. Managing this territory was no small task, but Ramses knew that efficient communication and transportation systems were crucial for maintaining Egypt's strength. Of course, a lot of these infrastructural projects, like the construction of roads, ports, and canals, were closely tied to Ramses' grand architectural vision. While he may have been known for his massive temples and statues, he also invested heavily in the practical infrastructure that allowed Egypt to thrive. This included the construction of fortresses and garrisons along the empire's borders, ensuring that Egypt's military was always in a position to defend its territories. Ramses knew that a well-organized, efficient empire was one that could withstand the pressures of internal and external threats. It's also worth noting that Ramses was not just concerned with the physical infrastructure of Egypt. He understood the importance of maintaining a stable and effective bureaucracy to manage the empire's day-to-day operations. The pharaoh's administration was a well-oiled machine, with scribes, tax collectors, and regional governors overseeing everything from the collection of taxes to the enforcement of laws. Ramses worked hard to maintain this bureaucracy, ensuring that it remained efficient and loyal to his rule. This system allowed him to focus on the larger matters of war, religion, and diplomacy, while the inner workings of Egypt's governance continued smoothly. But there were, of course, challenges. Egypt's vast empire was not always easy to manage, and Ramses had to deal with periodic revolts and uprisings in the regions under his control. One of the most significant of these revolts occurred in Nubia, where Ramses faced resistance from local rulers who didn't want to bow to Egyptian authority. But Ramses, always the military leader, dealt with this challenge in typical fashion by launching a campaign to assert Egypt's dominance and securing the region for the empire. This military success not only solidified his control over Nubia, but also allowed him to exploit the region's resources, including gold and other valuable commodities. Despite these challenges, Ramses' reign was marked by relative stability. By the time of his death, Egypt had not only maintained its territorial holdings, but had also established itself as the dominant power in the region. While some of his successors struggled to maintain Egypt's grandeur, Ramses' reign remains one of the most prosperous and stable periods in ancient Egyptian history. And, as we mentioned earlier, it wasn't just about military success or infrastructure. Ramses understood the importance of maintaining Egypt's cultural and religious identity. His reign saw a renaissance in the arts, with Egyptian artists and craftsmen producing some of the finest works of their time. Ramses himself was portrayed in an almost endless array of statues, carvings, and paintings, all of which served to reinforce his image as the divine ruler of Egypt. These works were not just for show. They played a critical role in the public perception of Ramses. The statues and monuments he commissioned were designed to remind the people of Egypt's greatness and to remind them that Ramses himself was the living embodiment of that greatness. In a sense, every building he constructed, every statue he erected, and every monument he created was part of a larger effort to ensure that his reign would be remembered for centuries to come. Historians still argue about the true extent of Ramses' achievements. Was he a visionary ruler who built an empire that stood the test of time? Or was he simply a master of propaganda who used his wealth, power, and influence to shape his legacy in a way that overshadowed his real achievements? The answer, as with most things in history, is probably somewhere in between. What is certain, however, is that Ramses the Rad left an indelible mark on the ancient world, and that mark continues to be felt to this day. But no matter how we look at his reign, one thing is undeniable. Ramses knew the value of leaving a legacy, whether through military conquests, religious devotion, or infrastructural investments. He made sure that Egypt would remember his name, and thousands of years later, it's hard to imagine anyone forgetting the name of Ramses the Great. If you've been following along, you're already well aware that Ramses II's legacy isn't just a product of grand monuments, military victories, or the political savvy that kept Egypt at the top for decades. But beyond the physical remnants of his rule, those towering statues, the famous temples, and the battle reliefs, there's something else to consider when we think about his impact on history. The way his reign set the stage for Egypt's slow decline after his death. It's as if the mighty Pharaoh's reign was a double-edged sword, one that brought prosperity, power, and stability, but also sowed the seeds for a gradual unraveling in the years that followed. To understand how Ramses II's reign may have led to Egypt's later decline, we need to think about the long-term effects of his policies, particularly his emphasis on maintaining Egypt's image of power and grandeur. It's not that Ramses was a poor ruler, far from it. But one of the risks of ruling an empire as vast as Egypt's is that maintaining that empire can require more than just military might or prestige. It requires adaptability, a sharp eye for change, and a willingness to adjust to shifting political and economic landscapes. Ramses' immense building projects and military campaigns were designed to immortalize his reign, but they also came at a significant cost. The economic strain of funding these ventures, along with the constant demands of war, took a toll on Egypt's resources. While Ramses had the wealth and manpower to continue his grand designs throughout his life, it's important to remember that his successors didn't inherit the same advantages. By the time Ramses passed away, Egypt's resources were stretched thin. The immense cost of maintaining such an empire, and especially of upholding the extravagant standards that Ramses had set, proved too much for his heirs to handle. Historians still debate whether Ramses understood the risks of overextending Egypt's power, or whether he was simply too focused on his own legacy to worry about the long-term consequences of his actions. Some argue that he couldn't have known that his monumental building spree would put such a strain on the economy. After all, he was the pharaoh, and he had to project an image of invincibility. But others believe that Ramses, ever the master of image and perception, was fully aware of what he was doing. After all, as we've seen, Ramses was a savvy strategist, both on the battlefield and off it. His penchant for portraying himself as the eternal victor, the god king, may have been less about actual power and more about the need to solidify his divine status for future generations. One of the most telling signs that Ramses may have been aware of Egypt's long-term vulnerabilities is the fact that he focused so heavily on securing his dynasty. His extensive family, over 100 children, was not just a result of his personal desires, but a deliberate strategy. Ramses knew that securing his legacy meant ensuring a smooth transition of power, but he also knew that only a few of his many sons were truly equipped to rule. His succession plan, in the end, wasn't as foolproof as he might have hoped. Mereneptah, his chosen successor, eventually took the throne, but he struggled to maintain the vast empire that Ramses had built. And as we mentioned earlier, his reign marked the beginning of Egypt's slow decline. But while Ramses' successors were grappling with these internal challenges, the external threats to Egypt were also growing. Despite the peace treaty Ramses signed with the Hittites, the balance of power in the ancient world was shifting. Egypt's empire was beginning to face increasing pressure from neighboring powers. In particular, the Sea Peoples, a group of mysterious seafaring invaders, began to make their presence felt in the eastern Mediterranean. These invasions, which began in the late years of Ramses' reign, would continue to trouble Egypt for years after his death. Though Ramses' successors fought to defend Egypt's borders, the external threats combined with internal strife were a deadly cocktail that eventually led to the weakening of Egypt's military and economic strength. To make matters worse, the pharaohs that followed Ramses were not able to continue his legacy in the same way. They lacked the same resources, and their reigns were often marked by political instability and infighting. Egypt's central authority weakened, and regional governors began to assert more power. While Ramses had kept the empire united, his successors struggled to hold it together. Egypt was no longer the unstoppable force it once was, and the once glorious empire began to fragment. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Wait, are you saying Ramses was responsible for Egypt's decline? Well, not exactly. It's more nuanced than that. Ramses' son didn't single-handedly bring about Egypt's downfall. However, his reign, while undeniably one of power and grandeur, may have set in motion some of the forces that contributed to Egypt's eventual weakening. He was a product of his time, a ruler who lived for the present and worked tirelessly to ensure his legacy would last. But by focusing so heavily on the grandiose and the monumental, he may have overlooked some of the more subtle signs of trouble on the horizon. What's more, the sheer longevity of his reign, nearly 70 years, may have also played a role in Egypt's decline. When a single ruler is in power for such a long period, it can create an environment where power becomes overly centralized. Ramses was a dominant figure, and after his death, there was no one who could replace him with the same level of influence or charisma. His successors struggled to fill the enormous shoes left by the great Ramses II, and as a result, Egypt's stability began to crumble. Historians still argue whether Ramses could have done anything differently. Could he have implemented reforms to address the growing internal and external pressures? Could he have been more proactive in preparing Egypt for the future? The answer remains elusive. What we do know is that Ramses II's reign was a turning point for ancient Egypt. While his empire remained powerful and impressive during his lifetime, the cracks that began to show under his successors would eventually lead to Egypt's slow, inexorable decline. And in that sense, Ramses II's reign is a reminder that even the most powerful and accomplished rulers can only hold back the tide of history for so long. No empire lasts forever. No matter how many temples you build or how many battles you win, as great as Ramses was, his reign was, in many ways, the last moment of Egypt's true power. After his death, the great empire he had built slowly faded into history, just as all great empires do. Now, as we continue to unravel the grand story of Ramses II, we find ourselves entering a phase of his life where the glorious victories and monumental accomplishments begin to take a more reflective tone. The grandiose public image he had built, carefully crafted through massive statues, divine portraits, and epic military narratives, had a purpose. It wasn't just to showcase his power during his reign, but to ensure his eternal presence. Ramses, perhaps more than any other pharaoh, was obsessed with the concept of immortality. And while it's easy to get swept up in the grandeur of his monuments, there's a deeper, almost philosophical undertone to Ramses' obsession with ensuring that his name lived on. Let's talk about Ramses' monuments. They are a testament to the pharaoh's understanding of the importance of legacy. Of course, we've touched on his massive building projects before: Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, and so on. But there's something particularly poignant about his seemingly endless dedication to constructing temples and statues in his own likeness. When you look at these massive works of art, it's almost as if Ramses is trying to make an indelible mark on history. But why? Was it purely a matter of religious devotion? Or was he looking to create an image of himself so large and overwhelming that it would never be forgotten? Historians are still debating this very question. Some suggest that Ramses was driven by the desire to be seen as a god, a ruler who would transcend the earthly realm and join the gods in the afterlife. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs were often considered living gods, and their role was to maintain order and harmony between the gods and humanity. Ramses, with his military conquests and monumental projects, certainly fit this mold, but perhaps it was more than that. Maybe he was simply a man who understood the fleeting nature of human life and wanted to leave behind something that would stand the test of time, something that would remind future generations of the greatness of his rule. Take, for example, the temple at Abu Simbel. It's not just a religious monument, it's a statement. The four colossal statues of Ramses, sitting proudly at the entrance, face the river and look out over the land, seemingly keeping an eternal watch over Egypt. These statues, towering over 65 feet tall, serve as a constant reminder of his reign, of his divine connection to the gods. And the temple itself is cleverly aligned so that twice a year, the rising sun would illuminate the statues of Ramses and his gods, reinforcing the idea of divine favor. In many ways, this temple symbolizes Ramses' desire for eternal life, not just in the afterlife, but in the hearts and minds of his people. He wasn't just building a place of worship, he was creating a lasting symbol of his divine authority. And this wasn't just an isolated incident. Throughout his reign, Ramses continued to commission statues of himself, sometimes in colossal form, sometimes in more intimate representations. These statues were scattered across Egypt, so much so that no matter where a person traveled, they would encounter the image of Ramses, reminding them of his reign and his power. The irony, of course, is that despite all of this grandeur and all of this effort to be remembered for eternity, Ramses II didn't entirely escape the ravages of time. As we all know, the great monuments of Egypt have faced centuries of erosion, invasions, and the destruction of empires. Yet, in a way, Ramses' name has stood the test of time. His monuments may have weathered, but his image and his impact endures, even thousands of years later. Interestingly, despite his obsession with immortality, Ramses wasn't content to simply rely on his monuments to preserve his memory. He also took great care to establish a written legacy. Throughout his reign, Ramses had inscriptions carved into his temples and monuments, documenting not just his military triumphs, but also his piety, his role as a divine ruler, and his relationships with the gods. The famous Hittite treaty that Ramses signed with the Hittites, for example, was not just a diplomatic agreement, it was also a public statement. Ramses had it inscribed on a wall in his temple, ensuring that future generations would know about his diplomatic achievements. Even his reign over Egypt's most strategic territories, like Nubia, was commemorated in inscriptions, painting a picture of a pharaoh who was as much a guardian of Egypt's borders as he was a builder. These texts served as the foundation for his divine narrative. After all, in ancient Egypt, it was not enough to be powerful in life. You had to secure your place in the afterlife. And Ramses, with his deep understanding of Egyptian religion, knew that his legacy in the next world was just as important as the one he was building on earth. But as much as Ramses sought to create an eternal legacy through physical monuments and inscriptions, there's another dimension to this quest for immortality that we need to address: the preservation of his image in the collective memory of his people. Ramses didn't just build for himself, he built for Egypt. His monumental works were a way of reinforcing Egypt's grandeur, making sure that Egypt, as a civilization, would be remembered long after his death. And in doing so, he intertwined his personal immortality with the eternal greatness of Egypt itself. He became, in a way, the living symbol of Egyptian power and culture. And let's not forget that this legacy also affected the way Egyptians viewed their pharaohs for generations after Ramses. He set a standard that no other ruler could fully match. The next pharaohs, even those who were able to maintain Egypt's power, had to contend with the immense shadow of Ramses II. How could anyone follow in the footsteps of such a monumental figure? It wasn't just about the physical monuments, it was about the psychological weight of having to live up to the myth of Ramses the Great. But as we move forward, there's something almost tragic in all of this. For all his efforts, for all his grandeur and his brilliant construction projects, Ramses could not escape the cycle of time. His empire, like all empires, eventually faltered. The priests who once tended to his memory in the temples faded into obscurity. The monuments he erected began to erode, and Egypt, though still powerful, would never be quite the same after him. Historians still debate whether Ramses fully understood the fragility of his own existence. Did he realize that despite all his efforts, no ruler can ever truly escape the ravages of time? Or did he believe as so many powerful figures do, that his name would outlast the sands of Egypt. Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between these two extremes. But no matter what Ramses believed in his final years, what's clear is that his legacy, like all legacies, is subject to time's whims. It's a reminder that no matter how powerful, no matter how monumental, the journey of even the greatest rulers eventually fades into the past. And yet, even in that fading, Ramses II remains a figure whose name echoes through the ages. As we near the end of our journey through the life and legacy of Ramses II, we find ourselves looking at the man himself, not as a god king or a military mastermind, but as a mortal figure facing the inevitable. The end of Ramses' reign wasn't just a political transition, it marked a pivotal moment in Egypt's history. After nearly 70 years of uninterrupted rule, the pharaoh who had become the living symbol of Egyptian might and divine favor was no longer able to defy the ravages of age. His reign, as grand as it was, would eventually give way to the quiet, yet inexorable truth. Time waits for no one. In the final years of his reign, Ramses II was not the unstoppable force he had once been. At the height of his power, he had been everywhere, leading armies into battle, overseeing construction projects, making diplomatic treaties. But as his health began to decline, Ramses found himself becoming more of a figurehead than the dynamic, active ruler he once was. By the time of his death, he was an elderly man, possibly in his 90s, living out his final days in a world that had begun to change around him. Even the grand monuments he had built, his towering statues, the massive temples were starting to reflect the fading of an era. His death marked the beginning of a gradual unraveling, a slow decline from the peak of Egypt's imperial power. The glorious image of Ramses as a god king would not be enough to protect Egypt from the forces that were gathering both internally and externally. His successors, though not necessarily weak rulers, struggled to fill the monumental shoes that Ramses had left behind. But before we move on to the decline of Egypt, let's take a moment to reflect on what Ramses II truly left behind. His reign wasn't simply a period of military conquest and building, it was also a time of immense social and cultural transformation. Ramses was a patron of the arts, an active participant in religious affairs, and a promoter of Egyptian identity. His reign saw the flourishing of art, literature, and culture pieces that would survive long after his death, telling stories of his era to those who would come after. His temples, with their grandiose carvings and intricate reliefs, became a new standard for Egyptian architecture. Artists and craftsmen, inspired by Ramses' immense patronage, produced some of the finest works of the New Kingdom. These pieces, full of symbolic meaning and divine imagery, reflected the ideals that Ramses sought to promote throughout his reign. Through these works, the image of Ramses would live on, even long after Egypt's empire had begun to fade. But Ramses' contributions weren't just in the realm of art and architecture. He was also a significant figure in Egyptian religion. As the living god, Ramses took part in religious ceremonies and rituals that emphasized his divine right to rule. His close relationship with the gods was a central aspect of his reign, and he made sure that his connection to them was evident in everything, from the construction of temples to the dedicatory inscriptions he commissioned. By solidifying his divine status, Ramses not only reinforced his own power, but also maintained the stability of Egypt as a whole. The pharaoh was the link between the gods and the people, and Ramses understood the importance of that role. His relationship with his family also deserves attention. Ramses fathered an astonishing number of children, over 100. By some accounts, he understood that his legacy wasn't just about his own image. It was about ensuring the continuation of his bloodline and securing Egypt's future through his heirs. Some of his children, like his son Merneptah, would go on to rule after him, though none would truly match the greatness of Ramses II. It's interesting to note that despite the incredible number of children he had, only a few were truly capable of stepping into the role of pharaoh. This speaks to Ramses' awareness of the fragility of dynastic succession, something that would be tested in the years following his death. But as with all empires, the inevitable happened. Ramses' long reign eventually came to an end. At the time of his death, Egypt was still a dominant force in the ancient world. However, the power that Ramses had consolidated and the peace he had achieved through treaties like the one with the Hittites couldn't stave off the internal pressures and external threats that would soon plague the kingdom. The pharaohs who followed Ramses II, while still holding considerable power, were not able to keep Egypt at the height it had reached under him. The subsequent rulers struggled with the same issues Ramses had faced, maintaining the empire's military power, managing resources, and handling the delicate balance between the central authority of the pharaoh and the increasingly powerful regional governors. Egypt's military, once a dominant force under Ramses, began to weaken. And in the wake of Ramses' death, Egypt faced external threats that had been kept at bay for nearly 70 years. The Sea Peoples, a mysterious group of invaders, began to disrupt Egypt's stability, eventually leading to a decline in Egypt's power over the centuries. But for all the challenges his successors would face, Ramses II's legacy was never completely erased. His name and image continued to loom large in Egyptian culture, and the glory of his reign was remembered through his monuments and his descendants. Egypt, though eventually faltering, would forever be tied to the memory of the pharaoh who built its most iconic structures, waged its most famous battles, and shaped its destiny for nearly 7 decades. Historians still argue about Ramses' legacy. Was he the great builder, the unchallenged warrior, the god king who stood above all others, or was he a ruler whose efforts to secure his name for eternity unintentionally set the stage for Egypt's gradual decline? Perhaps the answer lies in the contradictions of his reign. Ramses was a man who understood the importance of legacy, of power, and of divine favor. But he was also a man who lived in a world that was constantly changing, no matter how much he sought to immortalize his reign. Time, as it always does, moved on. And so, as we look back at the life of Ramses II, we see the rise and fall of an empire, the ambition of a ruler, and the timeless struggle to carve a place in history. The pharaoh who became a living god, who built temples to his glory and led armies to victory, reminds us that even the greatest of rulers must eventually yield to the passage of time. But through his monuments, his family, and his lasting influence on Egyptian culture, Ramses II has achieved something more enduring than simply holding power. He has etched his name into the eternal sands of history. Now, as you settle deeper into the gentle hum of night, let's drift into the realm of Ramses II's afterlife, both literal and symbolic. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't the end but a gateway, a passage into an eternal existence shaped by the deeds and legacy of one's earthly life. For a pharaoh like Ramses, whose life was marked by unparalleled ambition, power, and spectacle, the afterlife was a carefully crafted narrative. Just as intricate as his earthly reign, picture this: the great pharaoh lying in his tomb, surrounded by treasures, spells, and images designed to guide him safely through the perilous underworld. The famous Valley of the Kings, where Ramses' tomb was found centuries later, was more than a burial ground. It was a sacred passage filled with the symbolic language of eternal life. His tomb's walls are adorned with intricate scenes from the Book of the Dead, a guidebook for navigating the afterlife, highlighting the journey through judgment, the weighing of the heart, and the eventual rebirth into the eternal realm. Historians still argue whether Ramses' massive tomb known as KV-7 lived up to his aspirations. Unlike the more elaborately decorated tombs of other pharaohs, KV-7 suffered damage over centuries, making it difficult for modern archaeologists to fully appreciate its original splendor. Yet, the tomb itself remains a powerful testament to his desire to achieve immortality, not just through monuments, but through a spiritual journey crafted to last forever. But here's a quirky tidbit. Ramses II's mummy, when rediscovered, revealed surprising details. Instead of the youthful, godlike image perpetuated by his statues, his mummy showed a man who had suffered from worn teeth, arthritis, and signs of age-related illness. No surprise for someone who lived to nearly 90 by ancient standards. It's a fascinating reminder that the grand god king was also a very human man, dealing with the aches and pains that even the most powerful cannot escape. Yet the way Ramses' body was treated after death was no ordinary burial. His mummy was carefully preserved and moved several times to protect it from tomb robbers and later disturbances. These efforts highlight just how important the preservation of his physical form was to ancient Egyptians' beliefs about the soul's survival. The preservation of the body was a cornerstone of their idea of eternal life. If the body decayed, the soul could not live on. So Ramses' afterlife was secured not only by divine status and ritual, but by the careful hands of priests and caretakers long after his death. On a grander scale, Ramses' afterlife legacy extends beyond his own body and tomb. His monuments, temples, and inscriptions were part of a larger cultural memory that reinforced his divine status and the eternal nature of kingship. His cult continued for centuries, with priests maintaining rituals that kept his memory alive. In fact, even into the Roman period, worship of Ramses and other Egyptian deities persisted, highlighting the enduring power of his legacy. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how Ramses was remembered differently in various parts of Egypt and beyond. While his monuments in Upper Egypt, like Abu Simbel, projected his divine power and military might, his influence in Lower Egypt and neighboring regions might have been more political or economic in nature. This duality reveals a ruler whose legacy was as complex as the kingdom he governed, part god, part strategist, part symbol. And speaking of symbols, you can't talk about Ramses' legacy without touching on the cultural myth-making that sprang up around him. Over centuries, Ramses became the archetype of the pharaoh in popular imagination, often exaggerated, sometimes misunderstood. For example, many people associate Ramses with the biblical story of the Exodus, where he is portrayed as the pharaoh who opposed Moses. Historians still argue whether this connection has any basis in historical fact or is purely mythological, a product of cultural memory blending with legend. This mythic image of Ramses as the pharaoh of the oppression contrasts sharply with the historical figure who made peace treaties and expanded Egypt's influence through diplomacy. But it also shows how Ramses' legacy was not just about stones and statues, but about stories that have evolved and persisted, shaping how we remember ancient Egypt today. As you listen, imagine Ramses' shadow stretching across millennia, from the bustling courts of ancient Thebes to the dusty halls of modern museums. His story is part history, part legend, wrapped in the mystery of ancient faith and ambition. And even though time has softened the edges of his reign, the echoes of Ramses II's life continue to resonate, reminding us that behind every great monument lies a story waiting to be told. Here you are, drifting toward the end of Ramses II's vast story, where the man, the myth, and the monument all blend into one as the sun sets on this epic reign. It's worth pausing to reflect on what Ramses truly represents, not just to Egypt, but to the idea of power and legacy itself. By the time Ramses died, after nearly 7 decades on the throne, Egypt had experienced a golden era of prosperity, military strength, and architectural marvels that still inspire awe today. But his reign also marked the beginning of slow, subtle changes that would ripple through Egypt's future. The empire he expanded so fiercely would eventually contract. The dynasties that followed would struggle, and the world itself would evolve in ways Ramses could never have imagined. Yet, despite all this, Ramses II's name remains synonymous with greatness, not just because of his colossal statues or his sprawling temples, but because he understood the story of power better than most. That it's as much about image and memory as it is about conquest and rule. He made sure that his story was told and retold through the ages, shaping how the world views ancient Egypt, even now. A quirky side note, Ramses II reportedly had a wicked sense of humor, known to enjoy witty wordplay and clever inscriptions. Even the grandiosity of his reign was sprinkled with moments of lightheartedness, reminding us that beneath the veneer of godhood was a man who could joke and enjoy life well when he wasn't busy commanding armies or supervising builders. Anyway, historians still argue how much of Ramses' personality can be truly known versus how much is projected by the monuments and inscriptions. Was he a ruthless autocrat, a benevolent ruler, or a complex mix of both? The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in between. He was a man of his time, shaped by the politics, religion, and culture of ancient Egypt, no less flawed or fascinating for it. Now, as you feel your eyelids grow heavier, imagine the great Pharaoh's colossal statues watching over the Nile, the whispers of ancient prayers drifting through temple halls, and the sun casting long shadows over the desert sands. Ramses II's story is more than history. It's a reminder that our desire to be remembered, to leave a mark on the world, is as old as civilization itself. So, as you drift off tonight, know that the legacy of Ramses II lives on, not just in stone or scrolls, but in the stories we tell, the dreams we dream, and the endless fascination with a king who dared to make himself immortal. Now, a gentle wind down to close the night. The story of Ramses II fades slowly, like the last golden rays of sun slipping beneath the horizon. The mighty monuments and mighty battles dissolve into quiet memories, soft and distant. Like whispers on the breeze, you feel the calm settle around you, a gentle hush that invites rest and peace. No matter the ambitions of kings or the passage of time, here and now, you are safe and still. Let your thoughts drift like the slow river, moving gently, carrying the echoes of a distant past. The weight of history lightens, replaced by the soft embrace of night's quiet promise. Let your breathing slow, steady and easy, as the world softens and stills. Sleep now, wrapped in the warmth of stories old and new, knowing that each dawn brings a fresh beginning. Tomorrow, you'll awaken renewed, carrying the quiet strength of ages past within you. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams